ladies and gentlemen, you're back once again with the Economancer. Today, we're going to be jumping back into communications theory. But before I jump into this topic, because this topic is rather interesting, we're also going to be talking about some directions of the channel. So here soon, I'm going to be going through some papers, some academic papers. Some of them are going to be in sociology, such as the nature of stratification, which goes back to some of the original work that I was doing. And then another part of it's going to be going into special interest groups and network analysis. Some of it may be me, pulling up my notepad and going through it. And some of it may be just talking with having the article up and discussing some of the parts of it, because I think that would be really interesting for people to see what some of the literature out there is saying about topics, anything going back from like 2005 to current. So I think that's a good place, and it seems to be in the voting and the polls that people want to see some of this. So today we're going to be discussing bias of communication. Why are we going to discuss bias of communication? So think of it this way. Humans, empires, societies are generally concerned with duration over time and extension into space. So Harold Innis was a Canadian economist and political scientist who developed the concept of bias as it relates to communication and media. According to Innis, all forms of communication and media have a bias toward a particular mode of time or space. Innis argued that the bias of a particular medium can have a significant influence on the type of culture and society that develops around it. For example, societies that rely on media with a time bias, such as written language, tend to place a greater emphasis on the preservation of knowledge and the maintenance of social stability, while societies that rely on media with a space bias, such as the telegraph or the radio, tend to be more open to change and innovation. Innis's theory of bias in communication has been influential in the study of media and communication and has inspired several other theories in the field. So we kind of touched on this briefly, but let's go into this. Time-based media, which means it's difficult to move, does not encourage territorial expansion. So this is that spatial domain. It's kind of limited, but it does encourage a culture over time, period. In this view, so things such as customs, sacred things, and morals. I would add that time-based media is the latent pattern maintenance of axiology. So if you remember any of my work on the agile system from Talcott Parsons, this is the latent pattern maintenance of axiology, and that is essentially the connection of ethics and aesthetics. So time-based media facilitates development and feedback for social hierarchies. For Innis, speech is the time-based medium, whereas we're using the term medium to describe a channel or system of communications or the information. So the medium provided the functional implicit behaviors, habits, and norms. Now, looking at some of the more recent analysis of speech, this has placed it in time-based medium because it requires the relative stability of culture and more community and communion for face-to-face contact. We could say something like tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is differentiated from articulable expertise or knowledge because it is not codified or easily explained. Thus, there is reputation influence in the knowledge or information as a lineage of transmission. Furthermore, Innis was himself biased to speech as it was more flexible and humanistic than written traditions, which he found rigid and impersonal in contrast. Space-based media that are light and transportable over long distances, facilitate the expansion of culture over space. So that's that spatial dimension. So a common form of this is paper, at least in Innis's view of space-based media. Transportation is a function of the transmission and vice versa. These forms of communication can transmit information over long distances quickly and efficiently and have played a significant role in connecting people and societies around the world. Another note on this, which I think is interesting, if anybody watched my conservative policy video talking about my cultural capital hypothesis, he has something very, very similar when he says changes from the margins of society, since the marginalized develop their media separate from it, it also follows that those on the periphery consolidate power and ultimately challenge the authority of the center or core part of society, which leads to this next part we'll get into in a moment. So, an interesting conclusion from Innis, which led to the work of Foucault, is the monopoly of knowledge. And if you're just thinking about what I was talking about, we have a periphery consolidating power, challenging the authority of the center or core. So essentially, he asked the questions: are there certain types of media or certain types of information monopolized? Are certain individuals or groups in control of access to knowledge? And are there people who legitimate that knowledge? So if you've read Foucault, he has a lot of Innis. They're eerily similar. I'm more than willing to bet Foucault based most of his work off of reading Innis, because Innis was huge at the time, even though most people don't know who he is. And why that is the case is probably something along the lines of media economics, media communications theory kind of went to the wayside during, I guess you could say, the post-positivist movement, so on and so forth. So his methodology, similar to someone like Peacham Sorokin, it lost out to this empirical methodology. So in fact, there was a debate on his own bias of communication leading to him not having his knowledge legitimated. But that's for another time. So, so here's the question: how do we answer some of those questions that he asked? And essentially, what I'm going to say is it's yes or no. But we can't really jump to any radical conclusions because it's not clear that this is a problem of selection on capability grounds. So, for example, we select individuals in academia because they are the best at what they do, or there's an active selection towards whose values we share and thus can rightly decode the message. Because in the communication paradigm that we've talked about, we must principally state that there are constraints on the channel, encoding, decoding, and noise, and all of this process of this is transactional transmission of information, or this co-creation of meaning that we've gone over. Therefore, it would make sense that you want to work with someone who you can share mutual information with and have the capacity, channel, and ability to encode and decode with others that are similar to you. And this leads to like a biased network, but it by no means assumes some conspiratorial legitimation of knowledge. But what matters here is the monopoly of knowledge leads to instability as there is competition for power via knowledge, coinciding with changes in communication and the medium or media, as we had just talked about, between those on the marginalized ends versus the core. And so a powerful insight from Innis was that the biases of communications lead to fluctuations of empires and nations. So this is that cyclical nature similar to Peacham Sorokin, who I plan on doing a video on. So you can imagine if you're more time-based media, so you're not going to be moving a whole lot, you're not going to be encouraging territorial expansion, uh, and you're not going to be encouraging expansion at all, because you're mostly going to be focusing on a very conservative view about your world, because you're focusing heavily on that latent pattern maintenance. As great as this is, it's not something that's going to allow for a lot of growth, whether from Trumpetarian engine of growth or scientific knowledge growth. But when we look at space-based media, we're now going to have this transport function or possible transmission costs or transaction costs in it. And so that's coming along with this transmission of information or the communications. And that would imply that you would have to keep moving and you have to keep changing. So this is kind of that chaos versus order that we're leading into. So if you're the system, whether it be an empire or a nation, and it's focused primarily on this type of communication, that movement, that transmission of information through that space-based media, then you're going to be overwhelmed by the type of change that's going to happen in your system. There's no stabilizing force here. And if there's no stabilization or equilibrium or homeostasis, whatever you want to call it, then there's going to be a major problem in what Talcott Parsons called the latent pattern maintenance function. We're going to have instability. And this makes sense because if you're focused on trying to change the world through your space-based media, you probably do not have enough time to focus on yourself. One of the key aspects that he looks at here is Rome. Before the first fall of Rome, it expanded well beyond its core, and that led to problems with them being able to evaluate behavior or norms or values or whatever. The rapid expansion of this space-based media and the reliance on space-based media limited the durability to control the population at some central level. And it also allowed for those outside groups to instantiate themselves in their own power through their communicative needs or through their communications. And so one of the key principles behind this that a lot of people either do two things. They take the Foucauldian stance that because of bias of communications, there is no knowledge, there's no objective legitimation of knowledge. And because of this, we have elites with knowledge that is outside the touch of the layman, and that is used to control them or at least manipulate them to the point of just going along with whatever the elites say. And the second is there's this strong emphasis on the collapse of, say, American civilization, because we tend to be more space-based media than we are time-based media. Culture is it's always been thought that America's greatest export has been our culture, but that's not really true because we're better at the space-based media more so than we are at the cultural inculcation of other places, right? Because we give them information, but that doesn't actually impact their latent pattern maintenance. But we're so worried about sending out ours that we're not worrying about our own latent pattern maintenance. However, when it comes to America, this is rather a difficult question to answer because there is an evolutionary process in the biases of communication that has to be taken into account. So it's not just one way or the other. For example, there's a large growth in time-based media of exchange of information associated with podcasts, right? So that would be speech. Further explanation here is that modern podcasts can be considered both space-based and time-based, depending on how they are used and consumed. In terms of their ability to transmit information over long distances, podcasts can be considered space-based media. Podcasts are typically distributed digitally via the internet, which is a space-based medium that allows for the quick and efficient transmission of information over long distances. This makes it easy for people to access and listen to podcasts from anywhere in the world. However, podcasts can also be considered a time-based media in terms of the way that they are typically consumed. Most people listen to podcasts by downloading or streaming episodes and listening to them at their own pace, often over the course of several days or weeks. That means that podcasts have the ability to preserve information and ideas over a long period of time, similar to other time-based media such as books or films, which, again, books can be considered a space-based media because it stultifies what the growth is, right? If you stick to one text, that is a time-based media, but it can also be a space-based media because you're moving it. And you can see how complex this gets when we're talking about the type of media and its use. But here we go. Overall, the classification of podcasts as either space-based or time-based media will depend on the specific context in which they are used and consumed. Second, there doesn't seem to be a strong emphasis on a more democratic version of legitimating knowledge these days, rather than, say, 20 or 10 years ago, where very few people would question an expert in a field. The information revolution, which refers to the rapid growth and widespread availability of information and communication technologies in the latter half of the 20th century and obviously in the 21st century, has had a significant impact on the way knowledge is produced, disseminated, and consumed. Some have argued that the information revolution has led to a more democratic legitimation process for knowledge, in which information is easily accessible and people have more opportunities to engage with and evaluate ideas and information. One of the main ways in which information revolution has facilitated a more democratic legitimation process is through the proliferation of the interest and other the internet and other digital technologies, which have made it easier for people to access a wide range of information and viewpoints from around the world. This has allowed people to engage with a diversity of ideas and perspectives and has given them more opportunities to evaluate and question the knowledge that is available to them. Additionally, the information revolution has led to an emergence of new forms of collaboration and participation in the production of knowledge, such as those online communities, social media, etc. This has allowed more people to contribute to the generation and dissemination of knowledge and has given them more opportunities to have their ideas and perspectives heard and considered. And when we're thinking about this, there's obviously something that has to be said about artificial intelligence as it's growing in. If you go back to one of my lives that I did where I was interviewing a sociologist about the interaction between humans and artificial intelligence, one of the things that's very, very important here is looking at the information technology revolution, information as it coincides with that revolution and how we're picking it up, right? Because we're looking at the model of communication and we're seeing all of this expansive knowledge, and it may not equal into more knowledge creation or meaning creation because there's still a problem in how people take that available information and turn it into knowledge, or take that available information and turn it into meaning. And then we add in things like artificial intelligence, and that also makes it more problematic because artificial intelligence can become its own redundancy mechanism in our articulation of knowledge and in our consumption of knowledge. And that may lead to a different type of revolution where there's a lot more focus on that artificial intelligence. And we're kind of seeing this right now with this chat GPT AI stuff, but that's for a whole nother video on the information revolution and artificial intelligence. Overall, while the information revolution has certainly had a significant impact on the way that knowledge is produced and consumed, it is important to recognize that there are also challenges and limitations to the democratization of knowledge in the digital age. For example, the abundance of information available online can make it difficult for people to distinguish between credible and unreliable sources. And there are also concerns about the role of algorithms and other technologies shaping the information that we are exposed to. So ultimately, I don't know if it will be a collapse of civilization because of the change in our biases of communication. And I don't know if it will be the collapse of the intellectuals because of the problems in legitimizing types of knowledge. But what I do think here is important is understanding that communication itself, whether this be time-based or space-based, is going to be biased, not by just ourselves, but also by society at large, and how this media interacts with that communication. We see a lot of critical and postmodern criticisms of architecture and aesthetics have led to, I guess you could say, a counter reformation or a reconstruction of pre-modern architecture and aesthetics. And this just provides a strong argument for the evolutionary process communication and how the bias of communication is also associated with our own evolutionary processes. And we shouldn't take something written by Innis over 100 years ago as gospel. Because at the end of the day, even if it was the case that we've seen all of these societies, nations, empires fall because of the changes in the communications process and the changes in the media, and the changes of the medium of exchanges associated with those communication transmission lanes or channels, whatever you want to call it. The key here is understanding that communication is biased, but it also has an evolutionary path based on our own expectations of what we anticipate for the future and how that will impact our own growth. If I think that there will be a significant problem associated with one type of bias in communication models, I'm going to focus on the other side or try to push it to the other. That anticipatory mechanism will have a recorrecting and chaotic impact, right? And what I mean by that is we have path dependency, but we also have emergent properties. And some of this I'm going to get into in some videos here soon. I'm going to be going into anticipatory models. And I'm still working on the communications math model. I was originally going to be doing it via, writing it on the board kind of thing. But what I found is it's a little bit more difficult to go through writing all of that while I'm trying to have a conversation about what it means. So what I'm probably going to end up doing is making like a PowerPoint or a Beamer slide and then going through it there and then having the conversation. But when I do the anticipatory and expectations models, whether I may go over the Lucas critique, and then I may go over and some of I think Rosenberg's work on anticipatory models and have all of that, and then try to connect it with these different communication models, and then also connect it to our day to day lives because that's really what's important. And with that, I'm the Economancer, and I hope you have a wonderful day.